So we're finally here. This is actually a video I've had planned out for a while. For those of you that might not have seen the video, in my top 100 manga list, I on purpose did not include One Piece, knowing the vast amount of people who would be wondering where it was, and the vast amount of people who would think I actually didn't have it in the top 100. As well as it worked out perfectly because I wanted to have the chance to reread the series and catch up on Wano, as I wanted to wait for Wano to finish. That way I could binge read and catch up on that, as I was pretty well aware from some of my friends that the week-to-week experience wasn't really the best. And any slander I've said about the series previously was also on purpose leading up to this video, as I despise your fandom and I wanted to make sure the feeling was mutual. So consider this me extending the olive branch and burying the hatchet, if you will. But now getting into it. One Piece is a story which has spanned over 20 years and has over 1,000 chapters, written by Oda. And with all that material, there is a bit of a challenge in condensing all of my thoughts regarding this series, but I hope to do my best. I think the best place is to start with its strengths as a story, and that is its world building and foreshadowing. I know this is something that everyone gets into regarding One Piece, but I mean, you have to talk about it when talking about this series. Overall, for being a plot-driven story, it has done an amazing job of utilizing that to its fullest potential. Be it that Oda does a really great job of setting up these arcs, and as they go on and more, they sort of escalate in this. But I think part of the primary reason as to why Oda just does a great job regarding world building isn't just due to his creativity, but it's due to the fact that he's able to introduce many different characters and subplots within a primary plot of an arc and throughout the primary plot of One Piece in general. Again, this is something that is relatively simple pre-Alabasta, but then once Alabasta and onwards, we start getting the inclusion of more characters. I think Dressrosa is a really good example, as there feels to be many different subplots regarding the story, therefore it feels more is at stake when defeating the antagonist. But again, one of the major things that this does is it makes it feel much more immersive. These places feel alive, and it feels like these characters do things when the Straw Hats aren't present. To put it in perspective, the vast amount of subplots that we get in arcs like Alabasta, Skypiea, Dressrosa, Wano, you usually don't see that from a story until it does its final grand arc, the big old war arc, right? And many stories don't handle that well. One Piece does this near every arc. Now, there is the reality when introducing many different subplots, you have to build them up, right? You can't just throw them in and then expect the audience to catch on. You have to introduce them naturally. Again, make this still feel immersive. And in doing so, certain stretches of certain arcs can feel a bit painful to go through, but yet those are just usually the exposition stages of arcs anyways, where you're kind of getting introduced to everything that's happening. Not every single chapter can be a climax, and not every single character that is used within a story can be given the attention of a primary character. That's just not how it works, especially in a story as vast as One Piece. Now, detractors of One Piece like to bring up the fact that it doesn't really kill off characters, and that might lead into a lack of tension when certain moments happen, but personally, I don't really think that's the case for One Piece, as I find myself incredibly immersed into the story. And part of the reason as to why is because instead of simply killing off characters and them no longer serving their use once an arc is finished, Oda brings them back, and I think the Reverie is a really great example of this. And I think this is part of the reason why the world feels so alive, and that's because he takes the time to show us these characters doing things outside of the Straw Hats. And that is the beautiful illusion of writing, creating a world in which characters feel like they live and breathe in said world. And that is the ultimate goal. So when it comes to anime and manga, I don't think there's many authors I could put up there with Oda regarding world building. Like, he's the dude. He's got it. And I also forgot to mention this, but many stories don't introduce a character, particularly an antagonist, until their role within a story becomes relevant, until it's their time to shine. But yet One Piece at times will introduce, mention, make the audience aware of an antagonist's existence hundreds of chapters before they're even relevant or primary into the story. My favorite character, Doflamingo, being the perfect example of this. Now, getting into the characters of One Piece, there's something that needs to be made clear. All because a story is plot-driven does not mean it cannot have excellent characters. And all because a story is character-driven does not mean it cannot have a compelling plot. It is just simply what the story chooses to focus on. And for the most part, One Piece being a plot-driven story, it is not a story that goes super long into its characters and the internal conflicts that happens within them. When we do get a look into the character, we usually get that via exposition regarding a backstory. I mean, that's usually the turning point in the formula when it comes to these characters. When I think of like my favorite moments regarding a character and when my opinion completely changed on them is when we got a backstory. I think a character like Sanji is a really good example of this. And this is probably going to be my hot take of the video, but so be it. I got to be honest. Pre-Whole Cake, I find Sanji to be pretty painfully mediocre and redundant. I mean, allow any other story, right? Just ignore that it's called One Piece. Allow any other story have a perv gag character for over 500 chapters. You guys would call him garbage. So thank the Lord Almighty for Whole Cake, because that instantly made Sanji one of my favorites within the Straw Hats. Before that, yeah, I didn't, especially after the near character assassination in Thriller Bark. And I almost had a heart attack because I thought they were going to bring it back in Wano. Oh, thank God that wasn't the case. But I am really fond of characters such as Law, who I think has an amazing backstory. And then you have Nico Robin, who has an amazing backstory. I think her character arc really beginning in Alabasta, but it goes into fruition once we get into Water 7, and then Enies Lobby is the payoff for it. I absolutely love that moment. I think emotionally it's one of the strong points in the series for me, as well as characters like Frankie, who I thought got a really good backstory in Water 7. I really enjoyed Chopper's whole backstory, and I think something that I do kind of want to touch up on now, and that is when you have a story as long as One Piece, with as many things that happens within the story and the different places they go and all the conflicts and just the amount of information that sometimes you're given regarding the story, be it things that happened in the past or things that are currently happening with other characters outside of the Straw Hats. At times it can feel like certain characters get completely sidelined, but I think that's partially due to the fact that their character for the most part is already complete. I think Nami would be my instant example of this, as I think her character already got dealt with way back in Arlong Park, but it has felt like since then we haven't really gotten anything new for Nami, but I don't really think it's necessary. Now, it is important to keep in mind that the story is ongoing, so there is still opportunity for these characters to be given more limelight again, or whatever it is. We just haven't seen the resolution for these characters. Now, there is someone in the Straw Hats that I do find to be painfully underwhelming. Despite the fact that he's my favorite Straw Hat, he's supposed to be the second-hand man, right? Regarding the Straw Hats. But really, outside of being cool, I don't really see much for him, and that's Zoro. Now, again, I've accepted the fact that One Piece, its strengths as a story is in other things. Again, world building, foreshadowing, and I mean, to think that some of the major things are yet to fully play effect in the story is absolutely mind-boggling, but I can't just sit here and say that Zoro is a good character, because I don't, maybe, am I missing something? Is there just something thematic that I'm too stupid to not understand? But for the most part, I find Zoro to be very, very just samey throughout the entire story of One Piece. He shows up, gets into a fight, shows his grit and determination and him wanting to be the greatest swordsman in the world, and then does some really cool technique and beats up another black person. That's Zoro. And I think that's partially due to the fact that, again, usually the turning point regarding a character and how I feel about them is via their backstory, right? And Sanji, we were lucky enough to get a second one in Whole Cake, but Zoro has probably one of the weakest ones. In Wano, I was expecting something else for Zoro, but all we ended up getting was sort of his tie to the blacksmith. And I mean, that was cool and all, but again, it wasn't anything regarding Zoro for me to go, oh yeah, nah, Zoro, he's up there with Sanji as a character. No. Sanji's got it right now, and it's not even close. I mean, don't get me wrong, Zoro has very positive traits, and he's a very likable character, but, like, I hope to see more for him. Now, I find most of the antagonists in One Piece to serve their role really, really well. I think Crocodile's really good. I think Enel is excellent. I think the best two, without a doubt, is Doflamingo and Katakuri, with Doflamingo being my number one, just because I think he's a character where Oda, once again, utilizes and showcases his strengths, building up the character, and then him being sort of this mastermind that's manipulated the plot of the story. I always found that to be really intriguing, as well as just his personality and his backstory and his moral code. All of that I found really intriguing with Doflamingo. Katakuri as well being a very honorable character. And then, of course, you have antagonists like Big Mom and Kaido, which are these big menacing threats, and then Kaido himself having a lot of build-up. So I think for the most part, the antagonists are really good, although not all of them. I find the main antagonist in Thriller Bark to be pretty underwhelming. I could care less for the antagonist in Fishman Island, although Fishman Island as a whole, although of course it's important for the story of One Piece, I think in the end it just adds more to Arlong Park for me. But getting back into the characters, it's been really cool to see the growth of characters such as Usopp as well as Kobe, which I was not expecting to come back in the way that he did, as well as introducing characters that are memorable in such a short amount of time. I think Whitebeard is an amazing example of this, as well as some of the admirals that we end up meeting and seeing here and there. Ace is one of my favorite characters in the entire series, and then you also have Yamato. Now look, I'm gonna keep it 100. I do not care what Yamato is because my answer is yes. And again, what I think to be so incredible of all of this is there's so much to talk about regarding One Piece as a series and the vast amount of positives it has and memorable characters and moments and all of these just grand scale arcs, and yet the biggest stuff is yet to be handled with. To me, that is absolutely mind-blowing. And so despite being polar opposites, Berserk and One Piece, both of them are some of the greatest stories of all time, especially regarding anime and manga, and yet neither of them have arrived at the climax of their story. Now, for a plot-driven story, you need a character who's really an extrovert, someone who will go out there and bring about change in their world. A character that is so joyfully optimistic, it's almost impossible not to root for them. Someone who will inspire other people and also perfectly embody the theme of the story, going out there and living one's life with freedom. Someone we see a careful crafting regarding their morals and how they are. Someone who can show a interesting amount of maturity despite how comedic they can come off at times. And this is where we get into Monkey D. Luffy. Luffy is a very interesting character, and one that, in comparison to some of my own favorite protagonists, is written in a very different sense. I mean, name another story that could wait near 500 chapters till after the beginning of the story to really get into your main character's backstory. No, like seriously, we don't really get a deep look into Luffy's past again until Ace's death, which I really find to be a turning point regarding One Piece as a story, where I think that entire stretch was truly a focus on Luffy, and is also, in my opinion, one of the strongest stretches, not just in One Piece, but just in manga in general. And Luffy has a really interesting sense of making sure that people have the choice and the ability to live their life as they want. I think in Whole Cake we see this as it's pretty evident that he could tell Sanji doesn't want to do this by his choice, and yet it all feels so weird to him as him being a member of his crew. There's also a very strong sense of family and unity with Luffy as well. And I think one of my favorite moments throughout the story would be with the Going Merry and the conflict between Luffy and Usopp. A very emotional moment. And again, be it although just a ship, the way that they were able to bring this ship to life, and especially at the end of the arc when the ship burns and they have to say goodbye, is one of the most emotionally impactful things in the series. And again, I don't think we go through all of this the same way if Luffy was a different character. It's really about how he changes the people around him, and in a plot-driven story, you couldn't ask more for your central character. And so despite having many other things that Oda chooses to focus on in One Piece, his ability to still create a main character as compelling as Luffy is nothing short of impressive, and I think one of the most recent things to happen with Gear 5 is another great example of this. Not only do I think thematically it works, but again, the foreshadowing and the build-up leading up to this was absolutely incredible. As well as I always felt like the cartoony style, the rubber house style of this is probably one of my favorite things about it. And what is the most important fight of the series up to this point, we get a blend of comedy and cartoony mixed within that. And although you could argue that's always been One Piece's style, and there's really nothing at risk with Oda in doing such a thing, considering the fact that One Piece is the top-selling manga of all time by a lot. The build-up and then the payoff with Gear 5 was incredible, amongst one of the best power-ups in shonen period. So despite being vastly different, I find, to some of my favorite protagonists, I think Luffy definitely deserves to be mentioned amongst the best. Although, is he my personal favorite? No, I mean, come on, we all know who that is. Now, this is the part of the story where I was debating going in by arcs, but I felt like it would be a lot more efficient if I just went by the sagas in One Piece, and obviously starting off with the East Blue Saga, that's pretty much the introductory saga throughout the entire story, and it's still incredible that it's still that long, and to think that's really just the beginning of the story is incredibly impressive. But I think overall the East Blue Saga is like a 6 or a 7 for me. I think the strong point in all of that would be Arlong Park. We then go into the Alabasta Saga, which I find to be probably the point where I really started to fall in love with the story, especially once we get introduced to Chopper's character, but obviously the highlight would be Alabasta itself, which overall I'd honestly give, I'd say maybe around an 8, maybe a little bit higher depending on how I'm feeling at what day, but I feel like Alabasta does a really good job of introducing subplots, but it's not like later on in the story, especially like Wano, where Wano introduces honestly so many that are just hard to care about. You can even say the same about Dressrosa to a certain degree. And then that would lead into the Skypiea saga, which honestly, really the majority of that is just Skypiea, which I'm also inclined to give an 8 as well. Then we have a bit of an intermission before we enter Water 7, and that's Long Ring, Long Island, which... Anyways, Water 7 through Enos Lobby for me is a 10, without question. 10. I couldn't have asked for more. The same could not be said, however, for Thriller Bark, which is where I'd say One Piece's comedy can sort of be talked about here. At times it can feel redundant and old. For the most part, I'm indifferent. But man, it just felt so in Thriller Bark. I didn't really care about what was going on plot-wise with as well, just because it felt like it was revealed from the jump. Again, I found the main antagonist to be really underwhelming. I mean, the big old giant was more memorable than him. And honestly, the moments that, like, are positives for the arcs for me come at, like, the very, very end with nothing happened. But, like, then you have the moment with Sanji's character. Yeah, no, Thriller Bark is like a 4. And then we get into my favorite stretch throughout the entire story, the Summit War, the Marineford saga, and just everything with that was incredible. Seeing the Straw Hats be split up and defeated for the first time, and then we really get a focus on Luffy's character. I think Amazon Lily is the low point for that saga, be it although a necessary one. And of course, the strong point would be Marineford itself, and then sort of what ends up happening post that is, in my opinion, the strongest stretch in the entire series and my personal favorite. Also, 10 out of 10. 10. And after this incredible stretch, right, we get a bit of a time skip, and then the Straw Hats are reunited. We then get into Fishman Island, which is also like a 4 or 5. I could care very little for this arc. Again, of course, it's an arc in the story, therefore it is important, but the reading experience was not fun for me regarding this arc. I could not find myself caring much for what was happening, other than, obviously, the important information, especially regarding the ancient weapons and the poneglyphs, but man, oh man, oh man. We then have the Dressrosa saga, which Dressrosa in and of itself is one of my favorite arcs throughout the entire story, has my favorite antagonist in the whole story in Doflamingo. But it also has Punk Hazard, which in retrospect I understand is really build up for Dressrosa and Wano, so I'll give it credit there, but that was a very painful stretch to sit through. Although Dressrosa itself I loved, even though certain moments could drag on a little bit. For me, I'd give Dressrosa overall like a 9 as well. I don't give it a 10 just because there are certain parts that weren't the most enjoyable for me, but overall I still think it's a very, very, very good stretch in the story. Then we get into, I guess, what's called the Four Emperors saga. I don't know if I'm splitting these up right by saga, I just kind of like looked it up and this is what I got. But this would include Zoe, Whole Cake, the Reverie, and then Wano. Again, I think Zoe would be the weakest one just because that is really just the expositional stage where things are being set into motion. I think Whole Cake is great, especially for Sanji's character. I mean, I already got into that earlier on in the video, but thank the Lord Almighty for Whole Cake. And then we eventually get the Reverie, which I think is a really good look into the world and the politics of One Piece at this stage in the story. And then Wano, I've heard mixed opinions on Wano. I can understand it, especially if you read this week to week. God bless your soul. Acts 1 and 2 of Wano are a bit painful to go through, at least for me they were, and it does feel like a very packed arc where many, many different things are happening, and it's hard to really care about every single one of those things. But I do think the payoff we get in the latter half of Wano is more than worth it, and especially with Gear 5 and some of the revelations we even get, a look back into Odin's backstory, which would also include Roger. I mean, I thought all of those were really important stretches throughout the story. So if I were to take everything together with Whole Cake and Wano, yeah, I would have to say that this recent stretch in the story is also like a 9 or a 10. Again, the only reason I'm hesitating on giving it a 10 is because there are some pretty vast stretches that just weren't enjoyable for me in comparison to the Summit War saga, which even including Amazon Lily, I still could say I enjoyed that thoroughly from beginning to end. But regardless, it's still one of the stronger points in the story nonetheless. So yeah, really, when I look at One Piece as a story, if you want to know my honest thoughts, here they are. I think One Piece was, without a doubt, one of the greatest manga of all time. I think Oda showcases a plot-driven narrative to its fullest potential, and he's provided so many amazing characters throughout all these years, to the point in which, honestly, I'm envious of some of y'all that have been able to follow this series all this time, although I am not envious of the week-to-week reading experience. Again, God bless you. It's a world and a story that has gotten me incredibly immersed, unlike near any other story, and there are stretches of it that I absolutely love and showcase manga at its best. Although there are also some other stretches in the story where, yikes. I think the comedy at times can be a little bit redundant and painful, although for the most part, I'm usually indifferent towards that, and I do find myself pretty unsatisfied with certain characters. For example, Zoro, but to be fair, I think his character is yet to be fully dealt with, as I think there will be a huge confrontation between him and Mihawk in the future. I think Luffy is an amazing main character, and as someone who's been trying to get into writing myself, the dedication and the time that Oda has put into crafting this story, as well as the patience to foreshadow all of these things, build it up, or even at the moment, say he just came up with something on the moment, the way to integrate it to make it seem like it's been planned all this time is part of the beautiful illusion of writing. And I think in the end, when it's all said and done, One Piece will be a testament to Oda's persistence and his brilliance as an author. It's truly one of a kind in a league with very few other series. So there you have it. Those are my honest thoughts on One Piece. This has been The Masked Man. Hope everyone has a blessed rest of the day, and peace.